Your brain is being hacked every single day, programmed to make decisions that sabotage your future without you even realizing it. This isn't science fiction. It's happening right now, and you are the target. From the moment you wake up, behavioral patterns and psychological triggers are dictating your choices, costing you money, time, and opportunities. The question is, will you let these hidden forces control your life, or will you take back the power? Welcome to the Behavioral Hacks channel, where we dive into deep analysis, then tips to boost your everyday life. Ready for a wild ride, hackers? Today we're exposing how Huawei totally outsmarted the US ban and built this mind-blowing $1 trillion tech empire. It's a lesson we all need. We're diving into some super clever behavioral hacks straight from Huawei. You won't want to miss this. Lesson 1. Huawei's scarcity mindset led to HarmonyOS, which was running on 220 million devices by 2021. Lesson 2. Why millions still love Huawei, even without Google. Here's the final piece, and it's definitely worth the wait. Turning constraints into opportunities can totally change your life or business game. Let's dive right in. In 2019, Huawei faced what seemed like an insurmountable crisis when the US government cut off access to critical technologies. Instead of crumbling, they unleashed a wave of innovation that reshaped the global tech landscape. This chapter dives deep into how scarcity became their greatest ally, proving that even the toughest constraints can spark unparalleled creativity. Let's jump in. The US government's restrictions on Huawei are a prime example of how global tensions can change a company's path. Even with tough limits on access to key US tech like Google mobile services, Huawei has shown incredible grit. This situation is a fascinating look at how companies and consumers adapt when things get tough. Chapter number 1. The psychology of scarcity and innovation. In 2019, Huawei found itself in a real pickle when it suddenly lost access to crucial US components and software. Can you imagine the panic? But instead of throwing in the towel, they turned this challenge into a creative spark. After the US Department of Commerce put Huawei on the entity list, it became super tricky for US companies to sell to them without jumping through hoops for special licenses. This whole situation flipped a switch in Huawei, making them get really innovative. They started to explore new partnerships and develop their own tech, like the HarmonyOS. It's wild how scarcity can push a company to think outside the box and come up with fresh solutions, right? Scarcity psychology suggests that when resources become limited, cognitive bandwidth narrows to focus intensely on addressing the shortage. For Huawei, this manifested in two key ways. First, the company engaged in preemptive stockpiling of critical components, demonstrating the psychology of hoarding that emerges during perceived resource constraints. Second, and more strategically significant, the scarcity of Google services catalyzed the accelerated development of Huawei's alternative operating system, HarmonyOS. By the end of 2021, HarmonyOS had been deployed on over 220 million devices, demonstrating how necessity-driven innovation can rapidly scale. When backed by sufficient resources and existential pressure, this represents a classic example of how scarcity psychology can drive not just defensive measures, but genuine innovation when channeled productively. Chapter number 2. Cognitive bias. Loss aversion versus opportunity creation. The Huawei case provides a fascinating study in how organizations navigate the powerful cognitive bias of loss aversion. Prospect theory and behavioral economics suggest that humans tend to feel losses more intensely than equivalent gains, often leading to risk-averse behavior when facing potential losses. Huawei's leadership demonstrated an unusual ability to overcome this bias. Rather than merely attempting to minimize losses from US restrictions, the company reframed the situation as an opportunity for transformative change. The company made an autonomous business decision to reinvest its earnings and intensify R&D to secure its supply chains against political risks and diversify into new business areas. This cognitive reframing represents a sophisticated response to potential loss, converting threat perception into opportunity identification. The company's successful expansion into new domains like semiconductors, cloud services, and energy grids demonstrates how overcoming loss aversion can lead to more diversified business models. This stands in contrast to the typical organizational response to sanctions, which often focuses narrowly on substitution strategies rather than fundamental business transformation. Chapter number 3. Behavioral adaptation to crisis. Crisis reveals character, both in individuals and organizations. Huawei's behavioral adaptation to the U.S. embargo offers insights into the psychological mechanisms that enable organizational resilience. Despite facing severe pressure, the company increased its headcount by 20,000 workers between 2019 and 2022. Defying the conventional wisdom that sanctions inevitably lead to contraction, this counterintuitive expansion during crisis reflects several psychological principles. First, it demonstrates commitment bias, the tendency to become more invested in a course of action after making a public commitment. Having publicly vowed to overcome the restrictions, Huawei's leadership doubled down on growth rather than retrenchment. Second, it reflects anticipatory thinking, the cognitive ability to prepare for multiple future scenarios rather than simply reacting to immediate pressures. The company's adaptation extended beyond staffing decisions to its fundamental approach to innovation. While many organizations under pressure reduce R&D spending to preserve cash flow, Huawei intensified its research efforts, reflecting a psychological orientation toward long-term thinking even during immediate crisis. This behavioral pattern suggests an organizational culture that values future capabilities over present comfort. Chapter number 4. The power of strategic resilience. Huawei's resilience in the face of U.S. sanctions illuminates the psychological underpinnings of strategic persistence. The company's ability to weather the storm stems partly from its unique capital structure that lends itself to long-term planning. Unlike publicly traded competitors that must satisfy quarterly earnings expectations, Huawei's employee ownership model enables psychological commitment to longer time horizons. This structural advantage translates into psychological resilience through what behavioral economists call temporal discounting, the tendency to value immediate rewards over future benefits. Huawei's ownership structure helps counteract this natural human bias, enabling decision-makers to accept short-term pain for long-term gain. The asynchronous nature of the telecommunications equipment market, with intermittent rollouts of next-generation networks, further rewards this psychological orientation toward patience and persistence. Strategic resilience also manifests in how Huawei leveraged existing strengths while developing new capabilities to simultaneously pursue seemingly contradictory goals. Rather than abandoning its core telecommunications business in the face of restrictions, the company maintained its market position in many regions while simultaneously expanding into adjacent domains. This balance between exploitation of existing capabilities and exploration of new opportunities reflects psychological ambidexterity. The cognitive ability, chapter number 5. Consumer behavior and trust building. The embargo created a natural experiment in consumer psychology and trust. When Huawei devices could no longer access Google services, consumers faced a choice involving several behavioral economic principles: status quo bias preference for Android with GMs, loss aversion fear of losing familiar services, and uncertainty aversion concerns about an untested operating system. Huawei's approach to rebuilding consumer trust focused on creating a comprehensive ecosystem through HarmonyOS. Though initially stating there were no plans to launch HarmonyOS-equipped phone in the overseas market, the company focused on building domestic adoption first. This strategy leveraged the psychological principle of social proof. People tend to adopt behaviors they see others successfully using. Consumer adoption of HarmonyOS within China demonstrates how users can overcome strong habitual attachments to established ecosystems when provided with viable alternatives. The loss of familiar Google services. By creating a seamless user experience across multiple device categories, Huawei tapped into the psychological desire for consistency and integration, partially offsetting. Chapter number 6. The role of nationalism and consumer psychology. One of the most significant behavioral phenomena surrounding the Huawei embargo was the emergence of consumer nationalism in China. While nationalism isn't a new concept in Chinese consumer behavior, the U.S. restrictions on Huawei intensified this sentiment. In 2019, Chinese social media users actively promoted buying Chinese brands over U.S. technology products, particularly targeting Apple as an alternative to Huawei. Comments on Weibo, China's Twitter platform, revealed strong economic nationalist intent. I've also decided to buy a Huawei phone. I will change my plan from buying an Apple Watch into a Huawei product, wrote one consumer, explicitly describing this as an action to support Huawei. This consumer nationalism involves several behavioral economic principles. First, it demonstrates identity economics. The notion that purchasing decisions are partly driven by how they affirm our social identities. By choosing Huawei over Apple, Chinese consumers were expressing national solidarity. Second, it reveals how fairness perceptions influence economic decisions. As many Chinese consumers perceived the U.S. actions as bullying Huawei, finally it shows how collective action can emerge organically through social media. Consumers unofficially endorsing one another to throw their collective weight behind their local tech competitor. The psychology of reactance, the motivational response to threats against perceived freedoms, also played a role. As Chinese consumers pushed back against what they viewed as American attempts to constrain their technology choices. Chapter number 7. Lessons for individuals and businesses. The Huawei case offers valuable behavioral insights for organizations facing constraints. First, it demonstrates the importance of psychological framing in crisis response. By viewing the embargo as an opportunity for self-reliance rather than merely a threat, Huawei activated innovation mindsets rather than defensive postures. Second, it highlights how preparation and anticipatory thinking can mitigate crisis impacts. Huawei's stockpiling strategy provided a temporal buffer that allowed for more thoughtful adaptation rather than panicked response. For businesses, this underscores the value of scenario planning that includes potential supply chain disruptions. Third, it reveals how ownership structures influence time horizons and risk tolerance. Huawei's employee ownership model and resistance to public listing enabled psychological commitment to longer-term strategies that might have been difficult to sustain under quarterly earnings pressure. Organizations should consider how their governance structures either enable or constrain adaptability during crisis. Finally, the case illustrates how even severe constraints can spark creative problem-solving when coupled with sufficient resources. Rather than mere substitution of individual components, Huawei pursued system-level innovation, resulting in entirely new product ecosystems. Chapter number 8, Takeaway, Turning Adversity into Advantage. The Huawei embargo case ultimately reveals how behavioral adaptation to crisis can transform adversity into advantage. Despite the U.S. government's clear intention to limit Huawei's technological advancement, the restrictions paradoxically accelerated the company's development of indigenous alternatives and diversification into new business areas. This transformation was enabled by psychological factors including resilience, its cognitive flexibility, and the ability to maintain long-term focus despite immediate pressures. The company's success in weathering sanctions wasn't merely a matter of failed sanctions, but rather a muddled export control regime, coupled with Huawei's exceptional adaptability. For organizations and individuals, a key behavioral lesson is that constraints can be catalysts for innovation when approached with the right psychological mindset. By cultivating mental flexibility, maintaining long-term orientation even under pressure, and leveraging identity-based motivation, it's possible to convert external restrictions from pure limitations into drivers of creative adaptation. The Huawei case demonstrates that when behavioral economics principles are effectively harnessed, even severe constraints can lead to unexpected opportunities for growth and transformation. Chapter number 9. Conclusion. Wrapping it all up, this journey has been wild and full of surprises. The U.S. embargo against Huawei reveals profound insights about behavioral adaptation to crisis. While the restrictions created genuine challenges for Huawei's global business, the company's response demonstrates how psychological factors from scarcity-driven innovation to nationalism-fueled consumer support can enable unexpected resilience. As geopolitical tensions continue to reshape global technology supply chains, the behavioral economics principles visible in this case will likely become increasingly relevant. Organizations that understand the psychological dimensions of crisis response, from overcoming loss, aversion, to leveraging identity economics, will be better positioned to navigate similar challenges in an increasingly fragmented technological landscape. The ultimate behavioral hack may be the ability to see opportunity in constraint, a perspective that Huawei has demonstrated with remarkable effectiveness in response to one of the most significant technology embargoes in recent history. Here's the truth. If you don't hack these behavioral patterns now, you're leaving your future in the hands of systems designed to exploit you. But the good news is, you have the power to fight back. Start today by identifying one behavior you want to change. This video exposed the tools and strategies you need to rewire your brain, claim your decisions, and build a future on your terms. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a strategy that could transform your life forever. Your future self will thank you. See you on next Behavioral Hacks video.